I, 31F, have been married to my husband, Mark, 34M, for 5 years. Our relationship has had its ups and downs, but overall we've been solid. At least, that's what I thought. The real crack started showing when my mother-in-law, Karen, decided she wanted me gone. Karen never liked me. From the moment Mark introduced me, she made it clear that I wasn't right for him. She always had this fantasy that he would end up with his ex, Lisa, who was more suited for their family. Lisa was polite, well-mannered, and most importantly, worshipped the ground Karen walked on. I, on the other hand, wasn't about to bend over backward to please her. At first, it was just passive-aggressive comments, compliments with a bite, backhanded remarks about my cooking, subtle jabs at my career. Over the years, it escalated to full-on sabotage. She'd conveniently forget to invite me to family events, spread rumors about me, and do everything in her power to make me feel like an outsider. I tolerated it for Mark's sake, hoping that one day she'd grow tired of the games. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a regular family dinner, or so I thought. Mark and I arrived at his parents' house, and the usual group was there: his dad, siblings, aunts, uncles. But there was an odd tension in the air. People were glancing at me, whispering among themselves. Karen, on the other hand, was practically glowing. Halfway through the meal, she put down her wine glass and cleared her throat. The room went silent. She made a whole dramatic speech, announcing that she no longer considered me family and would no longer acknowledge my presence at any gathering. From now on, she said, I was not welcome in her home, or at any family event. She said she would no longer acknowledge me, invite me to anything, or allow me in her home. According to her, I had corrupted Mark and turned him against his real family. Everyone was watching, waiting for Mark's response. My own husband, the man who promised to have my back, just shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. He mumbled something like, "Mom, this is unnecessary," then went right back to eating. I sat there, stunned, humiliated. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't plead my case. I just nodded, put my napkin down, and left. That night, Mark barely said a word. He didn't try to comfort me, didn't even acknowledge what had happened. When I finally confronted him, asking if he was really okay with his mother pretending I didn't exist, he just shrugged. Maybe this is for the best, he said. That was my wake-up call. Karen thought she had won. She expected me to slink away quietly, humiliated and defeated. She thought Mark would just fall in line and let her dictate our marriage. What she didn't realize was that she had just given me every reason to fight back. Over the years, Karen had been reckless with her secrets. She had this habit of treating me like I was invisible, which meant she never really watched what she said around me. I knew things she wouldn't want getting out. I knew about the shady financial games she played at work, about the secret credit card her husband didn't know about, and, most importantly, about the affair she thought she had covered up. I started collecting receipts. I went through old texts, emails, anything I could find. Karen was careless. She left things lying around, thinking no one would ever question her. It was almost too easy. Meanwhile, she continued her little game. She texted Mark the next day, saying, "Now that she's out of the picture, we can be a real family again." He didn't even respond. A week later, she invited him to a family event without me. He hesitated but ultimately decided to go, saying he just didn't want to make things worse. That was it for me. If my own husband wasn't going to take a stand, I would. Karen wanted to erase me from her family. She wanted to humiliate me, break my spirit, and make sure I knew my place. Instead, she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because I wasn't going to sit back and take it, I was going to make sure she regretted ever underestimating me. Mark went to the family gathering without me. He hesitated, mumbled something about not wanting to make things worse, and then walked out the door. That was it. My patience was gone. Karen wanted to erase me? Fine. I was about to make sure she regretted ever thinking she could. The first step was simple. Karen had spent years bragging about how clever she was. Little comments here and there about how corporate money is just sitting there and how everyone inflates expenses. She thought she was untouchable. I knew better. She had shown me once, laughing over a glass of wine, how she inflated her company's travel and event expenses, pocketing the extra. They never checked the small stuff, she had said. But Karen was sloppy. She kept digital receipts and emailed herself details, probably assuming no one would ever question her. I went through old messages, emails she had forwarded to Mark by accident, even receipts she had carelessly left in their family group chat. It was all there. Flights marked up, meal costs doubled, reimbursements that didn't match. Everything I needed. I spent weeks gathering information, making sure everything was airtight. If I was going to report Karen, I needed to do it right. I spoke to a former colleague of hers, someone who had suspected financial irregularities for a while. I compiled everything I found: emails, discrepancies, even an old reimbursement Karen had bragged about inflating. Only when I was sure the evidence was solid did I send an anonymous tip to HR. 3 days later, Karen was on edge. Her usual self-important attitude was gone. She was snappy, constantly checking her phone, disappearing for calls. That night, Mark casually mentioned that his mom was dealing with some work stress. I didn't ask questions. I already knew. A friend of mine who worked in HR, but not at Karen's company, told me something interesting. An internal audit had been launched. Someone had tipped off HR about financial irregularities, and now Karen was under scrutiny. It was moving fast. Meanwhile, Mark started acting differently. He asked if I was okay. He even apologized for going to the family gathering. Guilt was creeping in. Karen, on the other hand, was trying to do damage control. She called Mark, crying, saying someone was out to ruin her career. She made herself the victim, spinning stories about jealous coworkers, false accusations, anything to make herself seem innocent. Mark comforted her, completely oblivious. But cracks were forming. I made casual conversation with Mark's aunts and cousins. Nothing obvious, just small comments, things like, "It's interesting how Karen treats certain people differently," or "Have you ever noticed how Karen always manages to come out ahead?" I didn't need to do much. The doubt was already there. I just gave it a little nudge. Some family members started reaching out, awkwardly apologizing for how I'd been treated. I acted surprised, brushed it off. But I knew what was happening. Karen did too. She started panicking, ranting that people were turning against her. She accused family members of gossiping about her, of trying to push her out. She was unraveling. And I wasn't done yet. Karen had another secret, one that would be much harder for her to explain away. For years, she had been having an affair with a married man. She thought she was careful. She wasn't. Karen thought she was untouchable. She had always been careful deleting messages, keeping her finances hidden. But over the years, small slip-ups had accumulated. A misplaced email, an old bank statement in the trash, a forgotten message thread. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough for me to start connecting the dots. At one point, Mark had access to the shared folder. He never cared enough to look, but I remembered. I went digging. It didn't take long to find what I needed. Screenshots of messages, hotel confirmations, photos, stupid, careless photos she had taken with him. One of them was a selfie in a hotel robe, the date and location right there in the metadata. Perfect. I created a new anonymous email, attached the screenshots, sent it directly to the one person Karen had no defense against, the man's wife. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The wife found out. Karen's lover was in deep trouble. The next day, Karen was unusually quiet. No dramatic phone calls, no self-pitying rants. She had no idea where the hit had come from, but the chaos was just getting started. And I was ready to watch it all burn. The fallout from Karen's affair started faster than I expected. The wife of the married man didn't just confront Karen in private. She made a scene. A crowded restaurant, a table full of people, and Karen sitting there as if she had no worries in the world. That changed the second her lover's wife stormed in. She wasn't quiet about it. She threw down printed screenshots, circled dates, and asked Karen if she had anything to say for herself. Karen lost it. She screamed, denied everything, tried to grab the papers. The restaurant went dead silent as she shrieked that this was all a setup. People pulled out their phones. By the time the restaurant staff stepped in to break it up, half the place had already recorded her. The video spread fast. Mark got a message from one of his cousins that night. No explanation, just a link. He opened it and watched as his mother stood in the middle of a restaurant, flailing her arms, knocking over a glass, and screaming at a woman calling her a homewrecker. He didn't speak for a long time after that. Karen, meanwhile, scrambled to do damage control. She called every family member who would pick up, spinning news stories. According to her, she was the victim. The wife had made everything up. The messages were fake. Someone had set her up. But nobody believed her. The affair partner disappeared. His social media accounts were either wiped or locked down. His wife, on the other hand, made sure the truth was heard. She sent messages to mutual friends, relatives, anyone Karen might have lied to. Mark stayed quiet. For the first time, there was doubt on his face. When he finally brought it up to me, I didn't react. Just shrugged and said, "Guess she's not as perfect as she wants people to think." Tensions in the family grew overnight. Some relatives sided with Karen, saying she was going through a hard time. But others, especially the ones who had been cheated on in their own marriages, cut her off immediately. Karen had always loved being the one to whisper rumors about others. Now, she was the main topic of every conversation. And things were just getting started. While Karen was trying to put out one fire, another was already burning. Her job audit was in full swing. HR had dug into her expense reports and found even more irregularities. The small things she thought nobody would notice, they noticed. She was placed on an immediate suspension. No work emails, no office access, no paycheck. The news spread. People in her industry started whispering. Karen had spent years building a reputation as a respected professional. That was gone in days. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a change in Mark. At first, he avoided talking about it. But as more of Karen's lies unraveled, he became more withdrawn. One evening, after seeing yet another message from his mother spinning her own version of events, he sighed. "I think I've been ignoring this for too long." Slowly, he began acknowledging how much she had manipulated him and us. Finally, one night, he admitted, "I should have stood up for you sooner. I let her control too much, but by then, I wasn't sure if I even cared." Karen wasn't done yet. She needed someone to blame. And since she had already lost the family's trust, she turned her focus on me. She told anyone who would listen that I was behind everything, that I had set her up, ruined her career, and hacked into her private messages. Nobody bought it. I played it cool. When Mark repeated what she was saying, I just smiled and told him, "I didn't do anything. Maybe karma's just catching up." Mark didn't argue. He was starting to see the pattern. The way his mother twisted reality to make herself the victim. The way she had manipulated him for years. But it didn't change the fact that he had let it happen. That he had chosen her over me. Karen was spiraling, but I wasn't finished. There was still one last move left. She thought losing her reputation was bad. She had no idea what was coming next. The HR investigation didn't just find what I sent them, it uncovered even more financial fraud than I expected. Karen had been sloppy, cutting corners and inflating expenses for years. The audit revealed falsified invoices, double reimbursements, and personal purchases disguised as business expenses. She was placed on indefinite leave. She had no idea who tipped them off, but she knew someone had. Meanwhile, her affair partner wanted nothing to do with her. The moment his wife confronted him, he panicked. He blocked Karen on everything, deleted old messages, and publicly begged his wife for forgiveness. He wasn't about to lose his marriage over her. Karen tried calling him over and over. Voicemails, messages, emails. He never responded. With her job and affair crumbling at the same time, she turned to the one person she thought she could still control, Mark. For the first time, Mark sat down with his mother and asked if any of it was true. The affair, the financial fraud, the meltdown at the restaurant. She lied to his face. According to Karen, everything was a setup. The affair was harmless, the screenshots were fake, the HR investigation was a personal attack from jealous coworkers. Mark didn't push back. He just listened. Karen wasn't satisfied. She needed a target. She became obsessed with figuring out who had ruined her life. She called family members, demanding to know who was spreading lies about her. She threw accusations at her coworkers. She interrogated her friends. Some of her relatives still believed she was a victim, convinced that she was being unfairly attacked, but others saw through it. For the first time, Karen's family was divided. Mark watched as his mother unraveled. He didn't say much at first, but it was clear the doubt was growing. Then came the final blow to her reputation. Her longtime friends, the ones she had spent years gossiping with, started distancing themselves. Nobody wanted to be associated with a woman whose affair was being talked about in local circles. They stopped answering her calls. One by one, they faded out. Karen was officially alone, but she wasn't done. She needed someone to blame. In a desperate attempt to save face, she tried to frame me. She started spreading a news story that I had somehow hacked her emails, planted fake evidence, and manipulated HR into investigating her. It backfired immediately. People laughed behind her back. Nobody believed her. The idea that I, someone with zero interest in corporate fraud, had orchestrated this grand scheme was ridiculous. She just looked more unhinged. That's when she finally snapped. The call came in the middle of the night. No warning, no hesitation, just screaming. Karen's voice was shaking with rage, shrieking that I was a jealous snake who had destroyed her life. She ranted about how I had taken everything from her, how I had poisoned Mark against her, how I was going to pay for what I had done. I let her scream. Then, when she finally paused to take a breath, I said, "Karen, I didn't do anything. Maybe you should take a long look at the choices you made." Then I hung up. Mark was standing in the doorway. He had heard everything. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, finally, he muttered, "She's lost it." I just looked at him and said, "She lost it a long time ago." 2 days later, HR completed their investigation. Karen was officially fired. She lost everything: her pension, her credibility, her career. She was blacklisted in her industry. The panic set in fast. She called relatives, begging for support. She tried to rally sympathy, claiming she had been wrongfully terminated. But nobody wanted to be associated with her anymore. One by one, they all turned their backs. Karen was powerless. And I wasn't done yet. The fallout from Karen's affair spread like wildfire. Family members who had always looked up to her were now whispering behind her back. Even the elderly relatives, the ones who once defended her, exchanged looks and shook their heads when her name was mentioned. Karen didn't take it well. She went into full damage control mode, claiming she had been seduced and didn't know the man was married. It was a weak excuse. The problem? She had bragged about the affair before. The proof was already out there. The affair partner's wife wasn't done. She posted everything: the screenshots, the messages, the receipts. It wasn't just a private scandal anymore. It spread through local circles, appearing in group chats, small Facebook communities, and even getting mentioned in workplace gossip. Karen had built her reputation on being a respectable, professional woman. Now, people only knew her as a homewrecker and a fraud. And then, the biggest blow came. Mark's dad, who had stood by her for years, excusing her behavior, finally snapped. He saw the posts. He read the messages. For years, Karen's husband had turned a blind eye to her behavior. But after weeks of whispers, screenshots, and family members confronting him, he finally decided to face the truth. He asked her outright about the affair and the financial fraud. She tried to lie, as expected, but this time, the evidence was undeniable. At first, he was quiet processing, waiting for her to say something that made sense. When she didn't, he simply walked into their bedroom, pulled out a suitcase, and started packing her things. "You made your choices," Karen was all he said. She yelled. She refused to leave. She accused him of overreacting. He didn't care. He threw her suitcases by the door and told her to get out. Karen had spent decades controlling her household, manipulating everyone into following her rules. But now her husband was done. Mark stood in the doorway, watching as his mother tried every trick she had: guilt, anger, tears. None of it worked. He didn't say much, just shook his head and walked away. Karen left, but she wasn't giving up. She needed a place to stay. She had no job, no savings, and no backup plan. Karen had always pushed for Lisa, Mark's ex, to be part of the family. Even after Mark and I got married, she still talked about Lisa as if she were the perfect daughter-in-law. So it was no surprise that, after losing everything, Karen made one last desperate call to Lisa. But Lisa, who had long since moved on, had no interest in entertaining Karen's nonsense. She laughed and blocked her. Lisa, who Karen used to praise as the perfect woman for Mark. Lisa, who had absolutely no reason to help her. Karen begged. Lisa laughed in her face and blocked her. With nowhere else to go, Karen turned to distant relatives. One cousin, out of pure guilt, let her sleep on their couch. It didn't last long. Karen's entitled attitude made her unbearable. She criticized everything: how they lived, what they ate, even how they tried to help her. She was kicked out within a week. Meanwhile, Mark was processing everything. He admitted that for years he had ignored the signs about his mother, that he had let her get away with things he knew were wrong. He didn't say it directly, but the guilt was obvious. Karen tried one last time. She called Mark, crying, saying she had nowhere else to go, that she was sorry, that she had lost everything. This time, Mark didn't hesitate. He told her that he wasn't letting her ruin his marriage, that she had done this to herself. And then, he hung up. Karen was out of our lives for good. No manipulation, no lies, no second chances. And the best part? I never had to cheat, lie, or twist the truth. She destroyed herself. I just let it happen. Karen had nothing left: no husband, no job, no support. But that didn't stop her from trying. She spammed family members with messages telling them she had been set up, that she was betrayed, that jealous people had conspired against her. It was the same dramatic act she had played for years, but this time, no one was falling for it. The relatives who once stood by her, they were done. Karen had humiliated herself too publicly, burned too many bridges. She wasn't the powerful matriarch anymore. She was just a woman with a ruined reputation, desperately trying to stay relevant. Meanwhile, my life was moving forward. For the first time in years, I didn't have to deal with her manipulation. No more stress, no more passive-aggressive digs, no more walking on eggshells. I could just enjoy my life, And Mark? He finally saw everything clearly. He put in real effort to make things right, listening more, being present, actually choosing me over his mother for the first time. Karen was just background noise now. And yet, she still tried. With no one to manipulate, she focused on revenge. She decided to sue her former employer for wrongful termination, claiming she was fired unfairly. It didn't even make it past the first stage. The company had ironclad evidence against her. The audit, the expense fraud, the stolen company funds. She was lucky they didn't press charges. Her lawsuit was thrown out immediately. Her finances crumbled fast. After losing her job, Karen tried to lean on her financial safety net, but it wasn't enough. While she had money stashed away, it wouldn't last forever, especially with no new income coming in. She started selling off her designer clothes, liquidating what she could to stay afloat. But without steady employment, her resources began to dwindle. The expensive lifestyle she once bragged about was gone. Eventually, she had no choice but to move into a rundown, one-bedroom apartment in a bad part of town. It was a long fall from the life she had before. But even then, she wasn't done. She tried one last time. She reached out to Mark, begging, pleading, asking for help. He didn't hesitate. For the first time in his life, he told her, "I'm not responsible for you anymore." And he meant it. That was the moment Karen finally gave up. She stopped calling, stopped trying to guilt trip her way back in. It was over. We blocked her on everything: phone, email, social media. She no longer existed in our world. A year passed. Without Karen's influence, our marriage thrived. We traveled, renovated our home, actually lived without the weight of her toxicity. Karen, meanwhile, was stuck in her tiny apartment, miserable and alone. And the best part? I never had to lie, cheat, or manipulate her. She destroyed herself. I just stepped back and let it happen. For months, there was silence. No calls, no emails, no surprise appearances. It was almost too good to be true. Then Karen resurfaced. This time, she had a new strategy. She wasn't angry anymore. She was sick. She told anyone who would listen that she was dealing with a mystery illness caused by the immense stress she had endured. Something vague, impossible to prove, but dramatic enough to pull at people's emotions. She hinted at chronic pain, fatigue, complications from anxiety. She might need surgery. She might be in serious danger. But she never provided details. Her goal was obvious: manipulation. She started reaching out to family members again, playing up the idea that she was suffering alone, that she had nobody to help her, that if Mark had any heart left, he wouldn't let her go through this alone. The family chat didn't take her seriously. People barely reacted, except for the occasional eye roll emoji. One relative outright replied, "Get a job." Karen, her old tricks weren't working anymore. So she tried Mark directly. A long, dramatic message filled with regret, pain, and pleading. She was struggling to survive. She was destitute. She was sick and alone, abandoned by the only family she had left. Mark read it, sighed, then blocked her number. It was the first time he had ever done it. Karen spiraled. Losing direct access to Mark sent her into a full-blown meltdown. She started ranting online about how she had been abandoned by her own son, how certain people, meaning me, had turned him against her, how she had given up everything for her family, and now she was destitute and struggling to survive. The response was immediate. People roasted her. Instead of sympathy, she got hit with brutal comments. Didn't you cheat on your husband? Didn't you commit fraud at your job? Didn't your own son block you? One person even posted a screenshot of the affair drama, making sure new people knew exactly who she was. Karen deleted the post within hours. But she wasn't done. She called every extended family member she could think of. One by one, she begged for money. Nobody gave her a cent. Even her most loyal relatives had reached their limit. Some told her outright to get a job and stop making excuses. Others ignored her completely. With nowhere else to turn, she went for the most ridiculous move yet: legal action. Out of sheer desperation, Karen threatened to sue us for emotional damages. We barely reacted. We forwarded her nonsense to our lawyer, who literally laughed and told us to ignore it. Karen had nothing. No money, no leverage, no way to actually follow through. She disappeared again. This time, for what I hoped was the last time. But something told me she wasn't done yet. Karen always had one last pathetic move up her sleeve. For months, Karen had been silent. No texts, no emails, no ridiculous legal threats. It almost seemed like she had finally accepted her fate. Then she showed up at our house. Uninvited. Unannounced. She stood on our doorstep looking completely different from the woman I once knew. The polished, overconfident Karen was gone. Instead, she looked exhausted, desperate, and almost unrecognizable. Mark and I froze. We hadn't seen her in months, and now she was here, in person. She didn't waste time. She launched straight into her sob story, saying she had lost everything. She had no job, no friends, no apartment. She was couch surfing with barely anything to her name. Then she begged. Not even a sugar-coated request, just straight up pleading for money. Anything to help her get back on her feet. Mark and I exchanged a look. We didn't need to speak. We both knew the answer. Mark turned to her, his face unreadable, and told her no. Firm. Final. He didn't yell, didn't get emotional. He just looked her in the eye and said, "Mom, you did this to yourself. We're not responsible for you." Karen snapped. The fake crying vanished, replaced by pure rage. She started screaming, calling us cold-hearted and ungrateful. Then she turned on me. According to Karen, I had poisoned Mark against her. I had stolen her son. I was the reason her life was ruined. Mark didn't react. Neither did I. We just stood there and let her humiliate herself. By now, neighbors had started peeking outside. A few had fully stepped onto their porches, watching the spectacle unfold. One neighbor even pulled out their phone and started recording. Karen noticed. For a second, she looked around, realizing how pathetic she looked, standing on our porch, screaming like a madwoman. She didn't stop, so we gave her one last warning. She refused to leave. We called the cops. The moment she saw us on the phone, she panicked. She tried to backpedal, saying she just wanted to talk, that she wasn't here to cause problems. Too late. When the cops arrived, Karen had no choice but to leave. They escorted her off the property. And that was the last time we ever saw her. No calls, no messages, no more manipulation. She was finally out of our lives for good. A full year has passed since Karen was escorted off our property, and life has never been better. Without her constant manipulation, Mark and I finally got to just live. No stress, no drama, no mind games. Karen's name barely comes up anymore. She is completely irrelevant. Our marriage flourished in ways I didn't expect. Without her influence hanging over us, Mark and I became stronger. We communicated better, we traveled. We actually enjoyed life without the weight of her presence dragging us down. Karen had spent years trying to control everything around her. But the moment she lost her grip, her entire life fell apart. She had no job, no friends, no family willing to take her in. Even her most loyal relatives had cut her off. A few months ago, she made a weak attempt at rebuilding her image. She tried to act like a changed woman, posting vague, motivational quotes on social media. She hinted at a fresh start, claiming she had learned from her mistakes. Nobody bought it. People still remembered the affair, the fraud, the lies. The relatives she had once manipulated didn't want anything to do with her. Her social media, once filled with pictures of lavish brunches and expensive vacations, was now a ghost town. No likes, no comments, no audience. She had become exactly what she feared most, irrelevant. From what we've heard, she bounces around, living off whoever is willing to let her crash on their couch. Her old lifestyle is long gone. No luxury, no power, no control. She's not the woman who once dictated family gatherings or demanded everyone cater to her. Now, she's just that relative people avoid at all costs. Then, one final attempt. An email. One last, desperate message to Mark. A pathetic plea for help. He didn't even open it, just deleted it. That was the moment I knew he was done with her, completely. After that, we blocked everything. No phone, no email, no social media. It was like she never existed. Mark and I moved. A brand new house, a fresh beginning. A place that Karen never stepped foot in. A place that only belonged to us. She would never taint this home with her presence. And the best part? We're expecting a baby. Karen will never be a part of its life. She tried so hard to erase me from the family. Instead, she erased herself. And now, we're free, peaceful, happy. Karen is gone. And I never had to lift a finger. Karma did all the work for me.